The vanished boy of Minnesota, the Jacob Wetterling case. On an ordinary October night in 1989, three boys were riding their bikes home along a quiet stretch of rural road in St. Joseph, Minnesota. It was the kind of place where neighbors didn't lock their doors, a place where danger felt like something that belonged on television, not the streets outside your home. But at about 9 p.m., that illusion shattered. A masked man emerged from the darkness. A flashlight beam, a gun, a chilling voice. Within minutes, 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling vanished, taken in front of two terrified witnesses. No trace, no footprints, no vehicle seen leaving the scene. Just silence and a community thrown into panic. What followed became one of America's most haunting cold cases. Decades passed, leads collapsed, suspects walked free, families lived in fear. Entire towns changed their routines because Jacob was still missing. For 27 long years, Jacob's disappearance remained a painful, unanswered question, until a killer's confession finally revealed a truth more horrifying than anyone imagined. Tonight, on Dark Truth 25, we're diving deeply into the abduction, the investigation, the failures, the pain, and finally, the chilling resolution that shocked the world. But before we begin, please like this video to help it reach more people who care about real justice. Share it with anyone who follows true crime and forgotten cold cases. Comment your thoughts and theories. We read everything. And subscribe to Dark Truth 25 so you never miss our deep investigations into the world's most disturbing real cases. Now, let's go back to where it all began, on a quiet Minnesota road, where a childhood ended and a 27-year nightmare began. The night Jacob disappeared. The night of October 22nd, 1989, began like any other in the quiet, rural town of St. Joseph, Minnesota. Children playing, parents preparing dinner, neighbors chatting across driveways. But as the last bit of daylight slipped behind the trees, the peaceful air took on an eerie stillness, the kind that gives the impression something is about to go terribly wrong. Inside the Wetterling home, Jacob, his brother Trevor, and their best friend Aaron were getting ready for a simple childhood treat, a trip to the video store, a movie rental, candy, a normal weekend ritual. But because it was late, and because small towns often rely on informal rules of trust, the boys chose to ride their bikes, cutting through a quiet stretch of rural road. No streetlights, no houses in sight, just the sound of their wheels crunching gravel and the cool autumn air brushing past them. It was a road they had taken countless times before, a road they believed was safe. But on this night, it wasn't. As the boys pedaled home around 9 p.m., a figure emerged from the shadows, a man dressed in dark clothing, holding a flashlight and a gun. He ordered them to stop, ordered them to lie face down, ordered them not to speak. The boys obeyed instantly, terrified. The man asked each child's age, his voice cold, controlled. Then, in a sudden move, he ordered Aaron to run toward the woods and not look back. Seconds later, he told Trevor to do the same. But Jacob was singled out. The masked man grabbed him by the arm. And just like that, the two vanished into the pitch-black night. Aaron and Trevor sprinted home in panic, crashing through the front door, screaming for help. Their parents' world shattered instantly. Calls to police followed. Alarms were raised. And within minutes, a once sleepy Minnesota community became the center of one of the largest search operations in U.S. history. Flashlights lit up the fields. Volunteers combed the roadside. Helicopters roared overhead. Authorities set up checkpoints across the region. But there was nothing, no footprints, no vehicle marks, no sign of Jacob. Just silence. This wasn't a child wandering off. This wasn't confusion. This was an abduction, carried out with terrifying precision. As the night dragged into morning, and morning slipped into the next day, every lead collapsed. Every sighting proved false. And the masked figure who appeared so suddenly had disappeared just as quickly. Chapter 1 ends with a chilling truth that investigators quickly realized. The man who took Jacob knew exactly what he was doing, and he had done it before. Chaos, community search, and police missteps. The moment Jacob Wetterling disappeared, St. Joseph, Minnesota, transformed into a community gripped by panic. Parents, neighbors, and friends scrambled, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Word spread quickly, and soon the streets were flooded with volunteers, search teams, and police officers, local and federal. The entire town mobilized, desperate to find a boy who had vanished in front of witnesses. But the chaos also exposed cracks in the system. The initial police response was frantic but disorganized. Officers focused on combing the immediate area but failed to secure potential escape routes. Lead tips poured in from panicked citizens and curious strangers, yet many were mismanaged, delayed, or dismissed. Time, the most critical factor in any abduction, was slipping away. The FBI quickly joined the investigation, but jurisdictional confusion slowed coordination. Multiple teams worked independently, sometimes duplicating efforts while other areas were left unchecked. Volunteers searched fields, roads, and rivers, yet the boy remained nowhere to be found. Local media amplified every rumor, adding pressure on law enforcement and amplifying public fear. Meanwhile, family trauma became front-page news. Jacob's parents, Patty and Jerry Wetterling, faced a nightmare that no parent should endure. Each false lead, each sighting that proved fruitless, deepened the family's anguish. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The pain of uncertainty was nearly unbearable. As investigators dug deeper, they realized this was not a random abduction. The masked man had acted with purpose and precision. Witness statements suggested he had prior knowledge of the area. Surveillance footage and neighborhood reports were scarce, leaving detectives to rely on intuition, experience, and fragments of memory from terrified witnesses. The case also highlighted the limitations of 1980s investigative technology. There were no cell phones to track, no security cameras on suburban streets, and no widespread DNA database. Every misstep allowed the perpetrator more freedom. Every lost tip pushed Jacob further out of reach. By the end of this chapter, one grim reality emerged. This was a calculated abduction, not a moment of opportunity. And for years, this realization would haunt investigators and the Wetterling family alike, fueling frustration, sleepless nights, and a relentless pursuit for justice. A case that went cold for decades. As the weeks turned into months, the search for Jacob Wetterling yielded no tangible results. The initial adrenaline of a community-wide search faded into a grinding frustration. Investigators hit dead end after dead end. Tips came in, promising leads that ultimately went nowhere. Suspects were questioned and cleared, while the masked abductor remained elusive. For the Wetterling family, the absence of answers was unbearable. Every holiday, every birthday, every moment that should have been filled with joy was instead consumed by fear, worry, and grief. Patty and Jerry Wetterling became advocates for missing children, speaking publicly about Jacob's disappearance, hoping that visibility might one day lead to recovery. The case exposed cracks in investigative methods of the time. Early witness reports were inconsistent, and evidence was limited. Police databases were not interconnected, DNA technology was in its infancy, and the lack of national coordination allowed the perpetrator to slip through unnoticed. The tools simply didn't exist to track the abductor across state lines. Media coverage brought national attention, but also brought pressure. Sensationalized reports often misrepresented facts, spreading fear and rumor rather than clarity. Investigators had to sift through thousands of leads while protecting the integrity of the case. Yet every trail faded, leaving only uncertainty and despair. Despite decades of no breakthroughs, a persistent sense of hope remained. Investigators revisited old evidence, analyzed past suspects, and waited for technological advancements. Every small detail, no matter how seemingly irrelevant, was cataloged for the day when the truth might finally emerge. By the end of this chapter, one fact became undeniable. Jacob's disappearance would not remain a simple missing child case. It had become a symbol of systemic failure, parental anguish, and the urgent need for innovation in child abduction investigations. The killer emerges, the shocking confession. Nearly 27 years after Jacob Wetterling's disappearance, a breakthrough came in the form of a confession that shook Minnesota and the entire nation. The masked abductor who had haunted investigators and terrified a family for decades was finally revealed: Danny Heinrich. Heinrich had lived a life largely unnoticed by law enforcement. A man who seemed ordinary on the surface but carried horrific secrets. Early investigations had suspected him, yet there was insufficient evidence to charge him in 1989. He slipped through the cracks, maintaining his freedom while Jacob remained missing. The confession was not spontaneous. It was the result of persistent investigation, meticulous evidence gathering, and tireless law enforcement work. Technological advancements, particularly in DNA analysis, finally provided the links that had been impossible to confirm decades earlier. When Heinrich spoke, he revealed chilling details about the abduction, how he targeted Jacob, how he executed the plan with precise timing, and, heartbreakingly, where the boy's remains were hidden. The community and the Wetterling family were faced with the grim reality. Jacob had been taken, held, and ultimately killed. This revelation underscored systemic failures and the terrifying lengths a predator could go to evade detection. But it also marked a pivotal moment of closure. While it could never undo the horror, the confession offered answers, legal accountability, and a measure of justice that had been decades overdue. By the chapter's end, the case had transformed from mysterious disappearance to a documented story of abduction, evasion, and resolution, a blueprint for understanding how child abductions can unfold over decades. Inside the investigation, FBI, locals, and breakdowns. The disappearance of Jacob Wetterling was not just a local tragedy. It became a national investigation, drawing the attention of the FBI, state police, and local law enforcement. Coordinating between multiple agencies, each with its own procedures and priorities, proved a daunting challenge. The first hours after the abduction were critical. Police blocked roads, searched nearby fields, and conducted interviews with neighbors. Volunteers scoured every possible hiding place. Yet the lack of early coordination created gaps in the investigation. Some witnesses were overlooked. Some leads went cold before they could be fully pursued. The FBI brought in its expertise on kidnappings and abductions, including profiling the unknown suspect. Behavioral analysts tried to understand the abductor's patterns. Was he familiar with the town? Had he planned this meticulously? The evidence suggested the answer was yes. But without concrete proof, the case remained frustratingly stagnant. Local law enforcement faced enormous pressure from the public and media. Parents feared for the safety of their own children. Schools increased security. Neighborhoods organized watches. But every tip and lead had to be meticulously verified, slowing progress. Innocent suspects were questioned, only to be cleared later, leaving families anxious and frustrated. Over the years, advances in investigative technology helped piece together fragments of the case. DNA evidence, previously untestable, became crucial. Old evidence was revisited, analyzed with methods unavailable decades prior. Each piece brought the investigation closer, yet the killer remained elusive, hiding in plain sight. This chapter explores the complex web of investigation, highlighting the dedication of officers, the challenges of collaboration across agencies, and the critical moments where the case could have been solved sooner. It also examines how small errors, lost evidence, mismanaged tips, or miscommunication allowed a predator to remain free for decades. Ultimately, the last session illustrates that solving a long-term disappearance is rarely linear. It is a painstaking process shaped by human error, persistence, and the evolution of investigative methods. For Jacob Wetterling's case, these cumulative efforts, though slow, eventually brought justice and closure, but only after decades of painstaking work. Psychological profile and predator patterns. As the investigation into Jacob Wetterling's disappearance unfolded, it became clear that understanding the mind of the abductor was as critical as the physical evidence. Law enforcement turned to criminal profiling, a tool that allowed them to anticipate behavior identify potential patterns, and narrow down suspects. The FBI's behavioral analysts studied every detail: the abductor's method of selecting a victim, the timing of the abduction, the location, and the apparent confidence in avoiding detection. Their profiles suggested a predator who was organized, patient, and deliberate. This was not an impulsive act. This was a calculated strategy designed to elude law enforcement and exploit predictable patterns in small-town life. Locals contributed insights as well. Friends, neighbors, and teachers described unusual behaviors in community members, fleeting glimpses of suspicious activity, odd habits, or unexplained absences. Each piece of information was logged and compared to the behavioral profile. While many leads proved false, a pattern began to emerge. The abductor knew the area intimately and understood the psychology of fear. For decades, investigators revisited prior cases to identify potential connections. Was Jacob's abduction part of a broader pattern? Were there similar incidents across other towns in the region? By mapping these events, law enforcement began to see recurring behaviors. Abductors targeting children in isolated areas, avoiding witnesses, and using deception to remain hidden. The chapter also examines the psychological toll on both the family and the investigators. The constant uncertainty, the repeated disappointments, and the pressure of public scrutiny created a unique environment of stress and obsession. For the Wetterling family, hope and despair became daily companions. For law enforcement, the case required extreme patience and meticulous attention to detail, often testing their professional limits. By the chapter's conclusion, the connection between behavioral profiling, investigative persistence, and eventual resolution becomes clear. Understanding a predator's mind was not just an academic exercise. It was an essential step toward justice. For Jacob Wetterling, the combination of profiling, re-examined evidence, and decades of tenacious investigation would eventually bring the case to a resolution that the world had waited nearly 3 decades to witness. Evidence revisited, cold case breakthroughs. Decades passed, yet the disappearance of Jacob Wetterling remained a chilling cold case. What investigators had initially viewed as dead ends were now opportunities thanks to advances in forensic science and renewed investigative techniques. Old evidence was carefully re-examined. Fibers, witness statements, and small traces once considered insignificant were now analyzed with modern methods. DNA technology, in particular, became a pivotal tool. Samples that had once yielded no results could now be compared against a growing national database. For law enforcement, this represented a new horizon in cold case investigations. Investigators also revisited suspect interviews. People who had seemed inconsequential in 1989 were now seen in a different light. Subtle inconsistencies, overlooked details, or suspicious behavior gained significance in the context of new forensic insights. Every conversation, every alibi, and every lead was scrutinized with a clarity that only time and technology could provide. The process was painstaking. Each step required methodical attention to prevent contamination, misinterpretation, or false leads. For families and communities, the waiting was agonizing. Every new clue brought hope, but also the fear of disappointment. This chapter highlights the critical importance of perseverance in cold cases. Investigators demonstrated how combining modern technology, careful record-keeping, and persistent analytical review could eventually uncover truths long hidden. It underscores a fundamental truth in criminal investigations. Even decades-old mysteries can be solved when science and human determination converge. By the end of this chapter, one message stands out. Cold cases are not frozen in time. They can be revived, dissected, and ultimately resolved, providing closure for families, justice for victims, and a blueprint for solving other unresolved crimes. Community, media, and the pressure of public attention. The disappearance of Jacob Wetterling was not just a law enforcement puzzle. It was a story that gripped a nation. Communities, local authorities, and media outlets all played a role in shaping the narrative, each adding pressure and scrutiny to the investigation. Local residents organized search parties, volunteer groups, and neighborhood watches. Families shared tips and rumors, desperate for information. The involvement of the public created both opportunities and challenges. False leads multiplied, resources were stretched, and investigators had to balance thoroughness with urgency. Media coverage amplified every development. Television news, newspapers, and later online forums spread information about sightings, suspects, and official updates. While the attention helped maintain awareness, it also created complications. Sensationalized reporting sometimes overshadowed facts, spreading fear, confusion, and even misinformation. Families had to endure repeated cycles of hope and disappointment as each new report arrived. Law enforcement also faced intense public scrutiny. Every decision, every mislead, and every investigative strategy was under the microscope. For investigators, the pressure was immense. They had to remain meticulous, unbiased, and patient, knowing that any mistake could delay justice even further. This chapter examines how community involvement, media attention, and public pressure influenced the case over decades. It also highlights the delicate balance investigators had to maintain, leveraging the public's eyes and ears without succumbing to panic or misdirection. By the end of this chapter, it is evident that complex cases like Jacob Wetterling's are never just about evidence or suspects. They involve human emotion, media dynamics, and community involvement, all of which can accelerate or hinder the path to resolution. The story illustrates that persistent collaboration between law enforcement and the public can be a decisive factor, even in cases that remain unresolved for decades. The hunt for justice, legal battles, and accountability. As decades passed, the disappearance of Jacob Wetterling became not just a story of abduction, but a legal and societal battle. Investigators, families, and lawmakers worked tirelessly to ensure that justice would be served, even after decades of uncertainty. The case exposed gaps in the legal system. In 1989, laws around child abduction, sexual offenses, and evidence preservation were less robust than today. Over time, advocacy by the Wetterling family and child protection organizations pushed for reforms, ensuring that missing child cases received more attention, resources, and legal teeth. The Jacob Wetterling Act is one such legacy, mandating that states maintain a national sex offender registry and establishing a framework to track offenders. The legal process was painstaking. Even after the abductor, Danny Heinrich, was identified and confessed, prosecutors had to navigate decades-old evidence, witness statements, and changing statutes. Ensuring that the confession could lead to conviction required meticulous documentation and adherence to due process. Every step of the legal journey was scrutinized to avoid loopholes that could allow the predator to escape accountability. This chapter also examines the emotional and psychological toll of prolonged legal uncertainty. Families waited for years to see justice enacted. The community had to balance grief, hope, and the need for closure. Advocates and investigators worked together, demonstrating the power of persistence, advocacy, and legal reform in achieving long-term justice. By the end of Chapter 9, it becomes clear that solving such a prolonged case requires more than catching a criminal. It requires legal innovation, systemic change, and unwavering commitment to ensuring that accountability transcends time. The story of Jacob Wetterling is thus not only a cautionary tale, but also a blueprint for improving the protection of children and the pursuit of justice in the decades that follow. Legacy of a vanishing, change, awareness, and lessons learned. The abduction and eventual resolution of Jacob Wetterling's case left an indelible mark on America. Beyond the tragedy of a missing child and the decades of anguish, the case became a catalyst for systemic change in law enforcement, public awareness, and child protection policy. Jacob's disappearance highlighted the vulnerabilities in investigative procedures in the late 1980s. From initial missteps to technological limitations, each gap underscored the need for better coordination, advanced forensic capabilities, and nationwide communication among law enforcement agencies. These lessons informed not only the Wetterling case, but countless future investigations, improving responses to missing child cases across the United States. The Wetterling family, turning personal grief into advocacy, played a crucial role. Patty and Jerry Wetterling championed legislation, influencing the creation of sex offender registries, rapid response protocols, and community alert systems. Their relentless pursuit of justice transformed their tragedy into societal change, ensuring that other families would have better tools and resources to protect their children. The emotional resonance of Jacob's story also created long-lasting awareness. Communities became more vigilant, schools implemented stricter safety measures, and families engaged in discussions about child safety. The narrative of loss, hope, and eventual resolution became a beacon, reminding society of both the fragility of life and the power of perseverance. Finally, Chapter 10 reflects on the lessons learned from this prolonged ordeal. The importance of patience, advocacy, and the marriage of human intuition with technology in solving crimes. Jacob Wetterling's story is no longer just about a vanished boy. It is about the transformative impact of tragedy, the pursuit of justice, and the enduring human spirit that refuses to forget, relent, or fail. By the end of this chapter, the audience understands that the legacy of one vanished child can reverberate across decades, reshaping law enforcement, community vigilance, and national policy, proving that even in the darkest mysteries, change and justice can eventually emerge. The Vanished Boy of Minnesota, Lessons in Justice. As we close the story of Jacob Wetterling, we are reminded that true crime is rarely just about the criminal act. It is about the lasting impact on families, communities, and the justice system. Jacob's disappearance and the decades-long investigation exposed systemic gaps, highlighted the importance of perseverance, and ultimately led to reforms that protect children nationwide. For the Wetterling family, the journey was one of unimaginable pain, hope, and resilience. Their advocacy turned tragedy into change, proving that even in the darkest cases, action can create real-world impact. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like this video, share it with friends and family, and leave a comment telling us what you think about long-term cold cases. Don't forget to subscribe to Dark Truth 25 for more in-depth true crime cases that uncover hidden truths and systemic failures. Remember, your engagement helps us bring more detailed investigations and stories to light, keeping victims' memories alive and educating the world about the importance of justice.